Katie Nickel, and I am an educator at the Ringling Museum. Today, we're going to be looking at a few works of art that have been inspired by the epic ancient Greek poem, the Iliad. The Iliad tells the thrilling tale of the Trojan War, a 10-year war waged by the Greeks as they laid siege to the city of Troy, often thought to be in Anatolia. The poet Homer wrote the epic poem, the Iliad, along with its sequel, the Odyssey, roughly 3,000 years ago. While we don't know exactly when the epic poems were composed, or whether Homer was even a real person, we do know that the ancient Greeks credited the poet Homer with both epics as early as the 7th century before the Common Era. Whether or not Homer was a real person, the tale told in the Iliad of the fall of Ilium, or Troy, has inspired authors, poets, and artists for thousands of years. And the next few works of art we're going to look at were made long after Homer's lifetime. The first work of art we're going to look at is this narrative painting by the Italian artist Giuseppe Gessi, painted around the 1690s. It's called The Judgement of Paris, and it shows the story of how the Trojan War got started. Now, this particular story is only briefly mentioned in the Iliad. Homer tacks it in while the guards are quarreling over whether Achilles should be allowed to drag the slain Hector's body after he is killed. But the story of the Judgment of Paris is common in many other Greek and Roman myths and stories, and it remains a popular subject for artists to depict. Another popular subject for artists to depict is unclothed women. The female body has been objectified in art for a long time, and in Christian Europe, paintings that illustrated Greek and Roman myths, in other words, pagan, non-Christian myths, were a handy excuse for male artists and male collectors to portray women's bodies in really sensual ways. But I digress. This painting is sometimes known as a narrative painting because it was ostensibly created to convey a story. Here we see Paris in royal purple, holding a golden orb in his left hand, and a shepherd's crook rests on his right arm. He is leaning backwards to talk with Hermes, the messenger god, who is dressed in brown, and we seem to have interrupted their conversation. But hold on, let's back this story up a bit to set the scene. The goddess of discord, Eris, threw a golden apple to the gods and stated the apple was for the most beautiful goddess. If you know anything about the jealous tempers of the Greek gods, it should come as no surprise that absolute chaos, discord if you will, gripped the goddesses. The male gods, full of wisdom, were too worried about breaking alliances, marriages, or their reputations to vote for the most beautiful goddess themselves. So they asked Hermes to find a suitable mortal man to judge the beauty contest for them. Enter Paris. The fact that Paris was chosen to judge the most beautiful goddesses is a cruel twist of fate. Some myths state that Paris, who is the younger son of Priam, king of Troy, was sent away by his king father to save his life. There is a prophecy that Troy would be destroyed by the actions and decisions of Paris, but King Priam couldn't bring himself to kill his son. Instead, King Priam sent Paris to live with shepherds, which explains why Paris is holding a shepherd's crook. Despite his humble occupation, we also see Paris dressed in rich purple, a color that is typically reserved for kings. The artist Gessi gives a nod to Paris's complicated origins as both a prince of Troy and as a shepherd. This painting shows Paris the moment before he makes his decision or his judgment. How would you describe Paris's mood or his feelings right here before he makes his decision? And who exactly are these women modeling for? If this is a narrative painting of Paris's judgment, why do you think he is so detached from the main action of the painting? The three goddesses we see here vying for the prize couldn't win on beauty alone, since they were equally beautiful. Instead, they resorted to a very human price, bribery. And the first goddess that we see in the painting is dressed, or rather undressed, in swathes of green fabric. The fabric is just barely containing her modesty, held up by a small and mischievous-looking child with golden curls and white feathery wings that are protruding from his back. Based on this child's knowing grin, the wings, and the bow and arrow, we can pretty safely assume that this figure represents Eros, or the god of amorous love and carnal desire. Eros, known in Rome as Cupid, is Aphrodite's son, so the woman he is helping to cover, or maybe to uncover, is identifiable as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Aphrodite is shown totally nude, with modesty barely preserved by the intervention of Eros. Based on what we can see of Aphrodite, what can we assume she is bribing Paris with? The next goddess is dressed in golden armor and a flowing red gown, and she's undoubtedly the warrior goddess of wisdom and war, Athena. Need further proof? The artist has surrounded the figure of Athena with symbols of her wisdom and her might. Athena is dressed for battle, and an owl crowns her helmet, which is a symbol of Athena's wisdom. She's holding a spear and a shield which prominently features a Gorgon head. It's easy to imagine what Athena might have tempted Paris with if he chooses her as the most beautiful goddess. Athena promised Paris prowess in battle, and Gezi has shown her displaying the symbols of that power. But there's one more goddess in the mix, vying to be named the most beautiful goddess, and that's Hera. We see Zeus's wife half covered by a radiant white drapery and surrounded by royal and rich blue shawls. As queen of the gods, Hera wields considerable power, as we can see throughout the Iliad as she repeatedly spurs her husband on to rekindle the Trojan War. Hera is wearing a beautiful golden diadem on her brow, and additional symbols of her wealth and power are seated at her feet. Hera undoubtedly is here influencing Paris with wealth and glory and power. So, who does Paris choose? This is an impossible choice to make. Looking back to the story Gezi is telling us, what is some evidence we see, or maybe perhaps think is missing, that tells us Paris is struggling with an impossible choice? Personally, I see Paris off to the side, consulting with the only other man in the frame, and he doesn't seem too concerned. In fact, he's lounging and even looking away from the goddesses. What evidence do you see in the painting that informs how you think Paris is feeling? One thing is clear, no matter which goddess Paris chooses, he will make two enemies for the one ally he gains. Think back to your reading of the Iliad to see if you can figure out which goddess Paris ultimately chooses to award the golden apple. Homer tells the story of the Trojan War, when the Greeks banded together to rescue Helen from the city of Troy. The gods all took sides, with Aphrodite, her lover Ares, the god of war, and the god of poetry Apollo all siding with the Trojans. Athena, Hera, and Poseidon championed the Greek side. Ultimately, Paris has to make a decision. Will he choose power and wealth offered by Hera, military might and glory offered by Athena, or perhaps the love of a beautiful woman as promised by Aphrodite? If you were in Paris's shoes, which goddess would you choose? Paris chooses Aphrodite, unable to resist Aphrodite's promise of the most beautiful mortal woman, Helen, and he promptly sails to Sparta to steal Helen away from her husband, Menelaus, sparking the 10-year Trojan War. And speaking of Menelaus, here is a regal depiction of him. Despite being the wounded husband in question, the rallying cry for the Greeks' united warfront, and the character with the best reasons to hate Troy, Menelaus isn't actually the main warrior on the Greek side. He isn't even second. Homer focuses the Iliad on other Greek warriors, such as the wise and cunning Odysseus, or the powerful and prideful Agamemnon, and most noticeably, the hot-headed and complicated Achilles. But more on Achilles in just a moment. Menelaus, who is coincidentally Agamemnon's brother, takes a back seat for most of the Iliad, really only emerging to fight viciously against the man who stole his wife, Paris. And he would have won that battle too, had Aphrodite not spirited Paris away at the last possible moment. This head of Menelaus is captivating and intimate, but it wasn't originally designed to be an intimate standalone piece that we are looking at right now. Menelaus is sporting a warrior's helmet with his hair flowing long behind him, but he is staring off into the distance. So when I examine the sculpture in the context of the Trojan War, I find it easy to romanticize Menelaus' motivations. Maybe he is contemplating the loss and betrayal of his beautiful wife, or perhaps he could be mourning the death of his comrades. The sculpture that we see here is a bronze cast after a marble head that is currently in the Vatican. And that is one of the many versions to have survived from the so-called Pasquino group. The Pasquino group is a marble sculpture that is a Roman copy of a Greek bronze original. Are you still with me? The Greeks made many of the sculptures in bronze, and that was later melted down and reused, particularly in times of war. The Romans were inspired by ancient Greek art and widely copied their bronze sculptures in marble. So, while most of the Greek originals were lost and melted down, we can get a pretty good idea of what they might have been like based on the marble Roman copies that still exist. So this sculpture is a Roman copy of a lost Greek original, and it shows an older warrior carrying the body of a slain young warrior, which explains the pain we saw earlier in the head of Menelaus. While both of these men have muscular, healthy-looking bodies, there are a few ways that we can tell there is a significant age difference between the two. First, ancient Greek artists often used facial hair as an indicator of age and wisdom. The Menelaus figure, of which we have a copy of its head, he's featuring a large and full, luscious, luxurious beard, while the younger warrior is completely clean-shaven. Additionally, the musculature on the two men is noticeably different. The older man has sinewy muscles straining under the weight of the younger man. The younger man still looks muscular and fit, albeit dead, but his muscles are smoother, indicating to ancient viewers that he would have been young and in his prime. There is some debate about who the figures in the sculptures are meant to depict. Some think the younger warrior may be the fallen Greek hero Patroclus, whom the Trojan prince Hector killed in battle. The older warrior who is carrying his body is therefore assumed to be our Menelaus, who protected Patroclus' slain body on the battlefield until the battle was over. Another possibility is that the two figures are instead Ajax and Achilles, showing Achilles after he was slain in battle. The Ringling has chosen to identify this figure as Menelaus, Helen's husband, though, since that is how he is most often identified in the literature on this sculpture group. Though we lose much of the story by viewing the head apart from the rest of the sculpture group, the head of Menelaus invites deeper thought and study of Menelaus the man. Who was he under all that armor? What might he have thought of the war that he helped champion? Menelaus may have been the husband of Helen, the woman who is said to have launched 1,000 ships, but he wasn't the leading hero of the Greek army during the Trojan War. Instead, the warrior Achilles is the focus of the Iliad. And this painting by Peter Paul Rubens, which was created in the early 1630s, shows a different side of the fearsome Achilles. Knowing that Achilles is in this painting, there is a lot we can figure out about the story depicted by Rubens here, just by observing the details in the painting. The action is centered on the panel with a woman kneeling down to dip a male baby headfirst into a river. I'm noticing that there is absolutely no reason why the woman should have her clothes falling off. So I'm suspecting that by painting a story from mythology, Rubens capitalized on the opportunity to paint a little peep at the female form. I also notice that there is a second woman, also inexplicably undressed, holding a lighted torch. What do you all notice in the background that gives us some clues about where the scene is taking place? I see dozens of naked human figures with outstretched arms reaching towards a single rower in a boat on the river. Looking to the sky, I see some ominous signs, bats and dark and moody clouds, and there's even a lot of light and smoke coming from a large fire in the distance. This is definitely not where I'd expect to find a mother bathing a child. And at the bottom of the painting where the child disappears into the river, I'm noticing something really unexpected. What I assumed was part of the river before, I now notice is a three-headed dog. A three-headed dog is a major clue that Rubens leaves his viewers to help us understand what story is taking place here. We're looking at Achilles' mother Thetis dipping her infant son into the river Styx, which is found at the entrance to Hades, or the land of the dead. And that explains a lot of the suffering and the ominous signs that we noticed earlier. Thetis was warned her son would die young, and to make him invincible, she took him to the river Styx and dipped the baby into the river, holding him only by the ankle. Achilles would go on to become one of the fiercest and most feared warriors in the world, siding with Menelaus, Agamemnon, and Odysseus on the Greek side of the war. Homer's The Iliad is full of thrilling tales surrounding Achilles, and his character is well developed and complicated. Achilles and Agamemnon are often at odds despite fighting on the same side. Achilles eventually refuses to join in the fighting after Agamemnon has wounded his pride by taking Briseis, a Trojan woman captive whom Achilles had originally claimed for himself. Achilles originally joined the Greek war effort with Patroclus, whom we met earlier while looking at the full Pasquino group sculpture. Patroclus and Achilles were raised together and went into battle together, and while Homer does not explicitly define their relationship beyond that of close friends, many other ancient Greek and Roman scholars had interpreted their relationship as intimate and likely sexual in nature, in keeping with common ancient Greek and Roman practice. Naturally, Achilles is devastated at Patroclus' death, where Patroclus dons Achilles' armor and Hector slays him, mistaking him for Achilles. Patroclus' death spurs Achilles on to take his revenge on his slayer, the Trojan prince and hero Hector, despite knowing that he himself will be killed in the effort. Eventually, Achilles does meet his fate on the Trojan battlefield, as predicted to Thetis, his sea goddess mother. Though we can see that Thetis took every attempt to save her son's life, Achilles eventually is killed by a poisoned arrow to the ankle. While Homer doesn't give us the details of Achilles' death, other Greek and Roman myths do tell us that Paris is the one who shot the dart from the walls of Troy, hitting the famed hero in the ankle, which, as we can see from this painting, is the only part of his body that went unprotected by the river Styx. In fact, the phrase having an Achilles heel, which means having a single weakness in an otherwise strong or impenetrable person, comes from the fate of Achilles, whom we're seeing here in this painting being dipped into the river Styx, but held by the ankle by his mother to prevent the baby from slipping away. If you've finished the Iliad or seen any stories of the Trojan War in films or television, we know how this story ends. Odysseus comes up with an ingenious idea to build a wooden horse and fake a retreat. The Trojans accept the horse as a peace offering and lead it into their city. But what the Trojans don't realize is that the horse is full of Greek soldiers who break out of the horse in the dead of night, open the city gates to the Greek army, and burn the city to the ground. But the story almost had a different ending, though. Homer doesn't tell this story, but the Roman poet Virgil begins his epic, the Aeneid, with the fall of Troy. Laocoon, a Trojan priest, warned the Trojans against accepting the wooden horse, knowing the gift to be a trick. Virgil tells us that the gods and goddesses intervene to ensure the fall of Troy. Athena set sea snakes upon Laocoon and his sons, silencing his pleas to the Trojans to burn the horse. This sculpture shows the agonizing moments after Athena has sent the sea snakes to kill Laocoon. We see Laocoon here in the middle, desperately grabbing and pulling on the snakes, which are already surrounding both him and his two young sons. Laocoon is in extreme, gut-wrenching agony. His face is incredibly detailed and expressive, and has often been cited by art historians as the prototype for human agony. In fact, ever since this sculpture was discovered in 1506, buried underneath Rome, it has been a massive inspiration for artists trying to faithfully depict human agony and suffering. Laocoon's face shows us the desperation of a man who is trying to save himself and his children from an agonizing death, but who knows he will not be able to overcome the sea serpents. And his face isn't the only example of high drama. Every muscle on Laocoon's body is taut and straining as he wrestles the snakes. And we can really see that example we saw earlier with the Pasquino group between the differentiation between an older, bearded man with sinewy muscles and younger, clean-shaven, more smooth-muscled men. While Laocoon's story does not have a happy ending, it is important to note as the end of the Trojan War. Thanks to Achilles' brave and fierce fighting, Agamemnon and Menelaus' leadership, and Odysseus' wise idea of the Trojan horse, the Greeks win the 10-year battle, reclaim Helen, and head home. Well, everyone heads home except for Odysseus, but that's the subject of a different story. Artists have been inspired by Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, for thousands of years and will likely continue to be inspired for years to come. The Iliad is a tragic story about humanity, the pride, the triumphs, and the pitfalls that all make us human. The artists we looked at today were inspired by the story Homer wrote over 3,000 years ago, or they were inspired by stories that were inspired by Homer. To this day, the tale of the Trojan War lives on in popular memory. When we talk about someone having a weakness, we say that they have an Achilles heel. Or when we warn against accepting a Trojan horse, we're really warning against accepting false hospitality or false gifts. The Trojan War continues to capture our imaginations. Thank you for taking a tour of the Trojan War at the Ringling today. Be sure to check out other stories and legends from mythology that adorn the Ringling's walls.